Welcome everyone, and we are very excited to launch a new online journal. It is a engaging many scientists over the world to join on a topic on special issue, and I'm the moderator. I'm Jinwoo Chun, a senior editor of Accounts of Chemical Research, and this is also supported by American Chemical Society. We are joined with Marcus Anderson and Eric Mills, who made this event possible. Let me just tell you a little bit about accounts. We have 4 editors, and editor-in-chief is Cynthia Boros at University of Utah, and Abigail Doyle, UCLA. She just moved from Princeton, by the way, and Bob Hammers at Wisconsin-Madison. And as you know, that the accounts is very special journal, and it deals with a easy to read overview of the chemical science and related research disciplines. And we focus on research from the author's own science, and we aim to teach the reader about interesting research project. We occasionally have special issues, and it generally covers a topic of excitement and also significance, and that's why we are here today. We have a special issue on transformative inorganic nanocrystals, which was published in April this year. And this topic is about state-of-the-art nanocrystals made through the transformation. And the nanocrystal will transform in response to the stimuli, and the outcome of the nanoparticles or crystals will be very useful for catalysis, energy, and active metals. And the special issue was edited by Liberato, Manna, and Ray, Schaak, and me. And Liberato and Ray will give talks today. And we covered 23 papers, and you see the list of the leaders in the field of nanocrystal chemistry. And we are fortunate enough to have 4 speakers today, Ray and Liberato, and Raffaella, Buonsanti, and Sara, Bals. But you are welcome to go through the special issue of transformative inorganic nanocrystals. So we are here today, and we start with Ray, Schaak, and each talk will be 30 minutes, including Q&A, and followed by Sara and Raffaella and Liberato, and then we'll end with Q&A after the whole session. So let me start with Ray Schaak. Ray Schaak from Penn State University. He is a DuPont professor of materials chemistry, and his research interest covers synthetic inorganic nanocrystals, solid state chemistry, and so on. And he is the leader of the field. He has many accolades and honors. And I think the one of the latest one is the ACS Inorganic Nanoscience Award. So let me finish it, my introduction, and let's start with the webinar. And Ray, please start with your talk.
Okay, thank you, Jinwoo. Let me get my screen shared quickly. There we go. Is that coming through okay? I think it should be. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. And if there are any technical issues, Jinwoo, just interrupt me and let me know, okay? So it's a pleasure to be able to start this off. What I want to tell you a little bit about today is work that we featured in this account special issue on transformative inorganic nanoparticles. And really, this is a collection of work by two recent graduates in my group. So, you know, I have the pleasure of seeing this in motion, but I have had two, you know, exceptional students who really took the lead on that. The first is Julie Fenton. Julie is currently a postdoc at Northwestern. She will be beginning as an assistant professor at Penn State in early 2022. So she will become a colleague, which is also a really exciting development. Ben Steimel just finished his PhD this summer and will be transitioning to a postdoc at Harvard. And so I want to talk about our work on what we title Made to Order Heterostructured Nanoparticle Libraries. And I want to, you know, for purposes of introduction, just calibrate all of us on what I'm talking about here. So heterostructured nanoparticles, generally speaking, are nanoparticles that contain multiple materials components integrated into them. And so, you know, you can think about that. There's a lot of examples. I picked two. There are many. I could have shown some beautiful work by Raffaella, but I'm sure you'll see some later from her talk. But some examples are in energy. You know, this is a cartoon of a solar-driven water splitting catalyst where there's different semiconductors and different catalysts integrated together. This is a light-emitting diode material that, again, has different semiconductors integrated together through interfaces. And so some of the key characteristics of these and many, many other heterostructured nanoparticles in catalysis, in energy, in nanomedicine, in optics, in so many areas is that they integrate together functional materials, multiple materials through interfaces. They're often integrated asymmetrically. As you can see from a situation like this, the asymmetry is important for charge separation. There is very precise spatial organization that is needed. And these four characteristics are superimposed on top of what this community has known for decades with just, you know, individual types of nanoparticles like quantum dots, where size and shape and uniformity and crystal structure and composition and surface chemistry and dispersibility and all of those things matter as well. So moving from kind of this focus on individual nanocrystals to these coupled nanocrystals really requires, from a synthetic perspective, which is what my group really tries to emphasize, simultaneous control over all of these. And, you know, chemistry is difficult, right? And we can't just mix together all the reagents and magically this level of control appears. And so there's many ways that nanochemists work to try to you know, develop methods that allow these kinds of features to all be simultaneously incorporated. I'll just mention two that my group focuses on. One is seeded growth. And again, there's many, many groups worldwide that do exceptional work on seeded growth. What we've been trying to do is just kind of push the boundaries of how many sequential seeded growth reactions we can achieve to start building up these heterostructured nanoparticles with the largest possible number of materials, controlled interfaces, et cetera. And we think of that as growing these interfaces externally off of a starting seed particles surface. The other approach, which is what I'll focus on today, which is in line with the transformative inorganic nanoparticles theme, is internal modification of a seed nanoparticle. So instead of growing externally, we're creating interfaces and modifying composition within the nanoparticle. For example, through sequential, in this case, cation exchange reactions that transform a simple starting material into a nanoparticle that's much more complex compositionally, asymmetry, interfaces, functionality, et cetera. Probably our favorite material is you know, both simple and complex at the same time. It's roxbiite copper sulfide. I have the formula in quotes. There's a lot embedded in these quotes. It's really copper 1.8s. I'll simplify it to copper 2 sulfide for now, but know that there's a lot of chemistry involved in that simplification. But suffice it to say that you can take this copper sulfide material and just in solution, these are colloidal nanoparticles, just in solution, kick out 2 of the copper +1 cations and insert 2+ cations, or even in some cases 3+ cations from solution to do this exchange reaction. And one of the really, I would say, important aspects of this chemical transformation process is that crystal structure is often retained. So I'm a solid state chemist, and so I love looking at crystal structures. And so when I look at this crazy crystal structure of copper sulfide, my brain kind of, without even trying, simplifies some of the craziness to make it a little bit more simple to understand. And the sulfur atoms that are in yellow here simplify to a hexagonal close packed crystal structure. So an AB stacking sequence. And for the most part, when you do cation exchange in these systems, barring any other kinds of issues, which there are cases where this doesn't hold true, but you essentially keep that AB hexagonal close packed stacking of the anions, and you can get the Wurtzite forms of zinc sulfide, cadmium sulfide, cobalt sulfide, copper-indium sulfide, copper-gallium sulfide, and many others. And so that kind of gives you a crystal structure picture of what we're talking about here. So I can't talk about cation exchange without really acknowledging, where this all came from. And I was a new assistant professor, and Paul Alvasados's work and many of the co-authors on that paper are leaders in the field today. Just beautiful work showing how cation exchange could be achieved in these colloidal nanoparticle systems. And again, without getting into too much detail, there's just really exciting and exquisite inorganic chemistry that's happening that really drives these reactions energetically. There's coordination, solvation, hard, soft, acid, base interactions that allow you to really kind of, do whatever you want in terms of switching up what cations are present and dialing in the composition that you want. These cation exchange reactions can be carried out to completion, which is pretty common. So for example, going from copper sulfide to zinc sulfide, but they can also be arrested before going to completion so that partial cation exchange is possible. And this is really powerful work that inspired our group quite a bit from Richard Robinson's group at Cornell. This is showing copper sulfide spherical particles and doing a partial cation exchange with zinc, where it forms these really neat sandwich type structures that break the symmetry of the sphere. And Alvasados's group and many others also showed striping patterns that can emerge from partial cation exchange. And the level of control and sophistication is really powerful using this quite simple idea of just swapping out cations driven by a lot of the solution chemistry interactions that are present. And so, coming back to what we were focusing on in this accounts paper, this idea of made to order heterostructure nanoparticle libraries, I want to give a very brief perspective on both of those aspects, the made to order aspect and the libraries aspect, to motivate what I'll be showing you. And so the first aspect is that of design, the idea of making to order. And what we did is we were kind of we actually got into this field thinking about crystal structures and how we could make phases that as a solid state chemist, I wouldn't be able to make at high temperatures. But you think about what all is possible from this nanostructure design perspective. And we started really wanting to expand on and asking questions like, how do you really precisely place materials wherever you want them in a controlled way within a heterostructured nanoparticle? Which materials, how many materials, what order are they connected? What are the interfaces through which they're connected? What crystal planes connect them? Can you control that? What level of complexity is achievable, right? The other aspect is scope, and that's kind of thinking about this word libraries. When you think of the word library, you think of a large collection. And any design guidelines that are developed, how broadly applicable are they? What is the scope of heterostructured nanoparticles that can be designed and synthesized? And then, perhaps I should have started with this, but the why. if you think about where we're at, right, 2021, we're at a point where we know a lot about how materials interact, what happens at interfaces. There's a lot more to learn, right? But we're at a point where we can start predicting what combinations of materials would give us certain functions just based on our knowledge and our hypotheses. And of course, computational predictions can go much farther than that. And really, you know, we're at a point where predictions are starting to outpace synthetic capabilities. And so some of the bottlenecks start becoming, can you actually make it in a time frame that's reasonable? The other is, you know, a lot of times when you think about experimentally synthesizing a certain type of nanoparticle, you're thinking about kind of one at a time. You have one target, you have a tour de force approach to make it, but that doesn't really allow you to kind of jump around and explore a wide space. Combinatorial discovery, on the other hand, by definition, is trying to, you know, explore a wide space. We're really trying to think about how can we achieve the scope, the hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of different possibilities that you could see combinatorially, but through rational design and without having, you know, 3 years needed to make, you know, one particular target to evaluate it. So that's where partial cation exchange comes in. It's a really ideal platform. This is a graphic that Ben put together for our accounts paper that just summarizes where the field is at, right? You know, many groups worldwide that are working in this area, just the way that partial cation exchange can be employed to make a whole bunch of different kinds of more complex nanoparticles through this idea of transformation, taking a template nanoparticle and modifying it to change its composition, introduce interfaces, have a wide variety of nanostructures that emerge. And so we were interested in, again, with those motivations in mind, really thinking about how we expand scope, how we get to a point of achieving high levels of complexity through as simple of a pathway as possible. And so what Julie and Ben decided to start with was taking our favorite copper sulfide material, looking at 3 different morphologies which are readily available, and asking some simple questions like what happens when you do 2 cation exchange reactions, cadmium 2+, zinc 2+, as a function of reaction time, where you're purposely not letting the reaction go to completion. And long story short, you know, spheres, rods, plates, there are different interfaces that emerge. There's different intraparticle frameworks, if you will, that emerge. You'll recognize these sandwich particles. This is what Richard Robinson's group had seen. Those show up quite prominently with the zinc exchange of copper sulfide. We see these Janus particles. We see various types of tipped nanorods, striped nanorods, and then some really, you know, complicated, patchy, and marbled particles for these plates, which I won't get into in this talk. But I want you to focus on kind of this middle aliquot set here, kind of, you know, halfway through the reaction. So we take these first generation particles, these are the seed particles we start with, and the second generation has integrated or introduced interfaces into them while also adding a new material. But there's still remaining copper sulfide, and copper sulfide is the material that exchanges. So if we take this kind of central group here, and that's what's shown here on the top, basically, you know, 1 each of these examples, all of them have remaining copper sulfide in them. So if the first exchange that we did going from this first generation to second generation was with cadmium, we can do a second exchange with zinc to replace the remainder of the copper with zinc. And likewise, if we started with zinc as our first exchange, we can replace the remaining copper with cadmium. And basically what that does is it produces derivative nanoparticles through this transformation pathway that maintain the shape and size and uniformity defined at this first generation, the interfaces defined at the second generation, but now have completely different materials incorporated within them. No copper sulfide remains. And so from a transformation pathway, what starts to emerge, this is a beautiful graphic that Ben had designed to go along with this paper. These 3 simple copper sulfide starting materials can be transformed, in this case, into 47 derivatives just through the sequential application of partial cation exchange chemistry. And that's that idea of transformative inorganic nanocrystals. But I want to talk a little bit about the role of crystal structure in this, because that's where this becomes, I think, really powerful and exciting. So if we take these nominally spherical copper sulfide particles that we start with, they're single crystalline. So while they're spherical in morphology, their crystal structure gives them asymmetry or anisotropy, for example, just based on where the crystallographic planes are and the differences at the atomic level in the spacings and arrangements of the atoms. So it could look coincidental that for these particles that look like, these Janus particles, it looks like I have these organized to be propagating left to right, where these sandwich ones I have propagating up and down. That's actually by design, and that correlates with the crystallographic features. So for example, cadmium sulfide, if you do a partial cation exchange with cadmium sulfide, cadmium and copper are not inherently, or cadmium sulfide and copper sulfide are not inherently miscible. So their preference is to remain segregated. Ditto with zinc sulfide and copper sulfide. If they remain segregated, they need an interface. Interfaces are inherently higher energy. So to minimize the interfacial energy, you want the smallest number of interfaces, and you want the interfaces to form that are the best lattice match, the most epitaxial with one another. And so what that does is it creates preferences within this nominally spherical particle. So for example, cadmium sulfide will, the sulfur-sulfur spacings in this crystallographic direction match with copper sulfide better than they would in that direction. And likewise, the spacings of the sulfur anions in the zinc sulfide interfaces best with copper sulfide in this direction. So there's an inherent crystallographic preference that puts cadmium sulfide next to copper sulfide in this direction and zinc sulfide next to copper sulfide in this direction. And so using those guidelines, we could actually start designing transformation pathways that allowed kind of exquisite placement of three materials within a nanoparticle. And so the result in these cases are spherical particles that have these subtly different arrangements of materials, these rods that have those same materials integrated in different ways. Those are essentially 5 different nanoparticle isomers of copper sulfide, cadmium sulfide, and zinc sulfide, where the locations of the materials within the particle correlate to the crystallography, the crystal structure relationship. So we think about this as regioselectivity that is defined by crystallographic relationships. I want to zoom in here in the last part of the talk on the nanorods that are kind of hinted at here. I didn't spend as much time talking about those, but we were really interested in, again, toward this goal of scope and made to order, really trying to understand how far we can push this. How versatile is it? How capable is it of designing in really high levels of complexity? And so the way these reactions are carried out is we have these copper sulfide nanorods in solution, and then simply inject in certain amounts of metal salt solutions where we're stoichiometrically controlling how many moles, right? What's the molar ratio of zinc 2 plus to the copper plus cations that are present in the nanorods. And in doing that, we can basically carry out multiple sequential cation exchange reactions where the amount exchanged is defined by those molar ratios. The order in which the materials integrate into the nanorod is simply a matter of what order did you inject the metal salt solutions. And the interfaces between the most recently exchanged part and the remaining copper sulfide tend to be a little bit more disordered, and we hypothesize a bit more reactive, and that tends to be where the next exchange goes. So we're able to kind of step down, in this case, from a tip of zinc sulfide, we're able to step down and put in copper indium sulfide, then copper gallium sulfide, then cobalt sulfide, and then cadmium sulfide, where the interfaces being horizontal or vertical come back to these crystal structure relationships. So there's really some simple guidelines, design guidelines that enable the made to order part. But then the next question is, these are really complex nanoparticles, but what's the scope? How far can we take this? And this is probably one of the the most complex figures that I've ever helped put together, but also I think one of the coolest and most powerful. And so what this represents is, here's our copper sulfide starting nanoparticle that the transformation occurs on. And then if we do a partial cation exchange with zinc, this leg of this chart here is basically following this arrow. So putting a zinc sulfide tip on a copper sulfide rod. But there's conditions where we can also get a central band of zinc sulfide or a double tip type of nanorod. And so there's basically 3 high yield samples that we can make through this first step. And if we consider just 5 cations, zinc 2+, cadmium 2+, cobalt 2+, indium 3+, gallium 3+, if we started with a zinc exchange, there's 4 remaining cations from that list. So we can carry out, any of these 4 subsequent cation exchange reactions. If we do indium, that's effectively doing exactly what I showed here to make zinc sulfide, indium sulfide, copper sulfide. We could have also done that with gallium, cobalt, cadmium. So if we do these 4 exchanges on this one, 4 exchanges on this one, 4 exchanges on this one, we're basically taking 3 different types of heterostructured nanorod templates and transforming them into any of these 12 derivatives. For each of those 12, there's any of 4 more exchanges we could do, removing the most recently exchanged cation. 12 times 4 is 48, 48 times 4 is 192, times 4 is 768, times 4 is 3072, times 4 is 12,288. So what this represents, kind of in a nutshell, is synthetic pathways, synthetically feasible pathways to making more than 20 or more than 12,000 distinct types of heterostructured nanorods using these simple sequential partial cation exchange reactions. And for these at the bottom, the cartoons show the total synthesis, right? The pathway that was used to make the rods that are shown experimentally here. And so if we now consider what is possible beyond this, I showed you all the possibilities, or represented all of the possibilities, from these 3 zinc sulfide, copper sulfide starting rods. Each one of these legs, so the leg that comes out of these single tip zinc sulfide, copper sulfide rods, leads to 5,460 derivatives. So that's where the 5,460 times 3, gets you your more than 12,000 that I showed here. But we can also make reasonably high yields of other starting second generation particles: copper gallium sulfide, copper indium sulfide, cobalt sulfide, and cadmium sulfide. And when you consider all the possible legs that can develop on a chart like this, you actually get up to more than 65,000 distinct possibilities. Doesn't mean we made all of these, right? We're just kind of showing, with these design rules applied in this way, this is what is possible to make. I think we had something like 113 or something that we experimentally observed that fit into this. But what this starts doing then is merging the scope that you would see in a combinatorial discovery platform and arbitrary design capabilities with rational design and scalability, and the ability to synthesize them in high yield samples. And just to show what I give a little bit of proof, high yield, when we zoom out, obviously we're showing individual particles a lot, but when we zoom out, there's a lot of uniformity to the heterostructured nanoparticles. There's a few where there's a little bit of over exchange, but overall they're behaving really well in terms of their uniformity and quality. And this at the top just shows, with this mix and match, these are 6 different isomers, 6 different ways of having combinations of zinc sulfide, copper indium sulfide, cobalt sulfide, and copper sulfide in these nanoparticles. So that's kind of the made to order part of it. And so I'm not going to dwell on this, but I just want to show there's a lot more that can be done when you start taking this partial sequential cation exchange and integrating it with other transformation pathways of nanoparticles. For example, breaking the symmetry of a sphere and then using the different surfaces for preferential deposition, the seeded growth part. You can merge seeded growth with partial cation exchange to begin growing different materials at different ends. Or there's also really nice and powerful etching chemistry that Richard Robinson's group showed really nicely, where you can etch out selectively the copper sulfide. So any regions that we have that have remaining copper sulfide, we can etch out to make even crazier types of nanoparticles with void spaces and intricate sculpting. So there's a whole other level that can be achieved by merging this with other techniques. And just very quickly to show where else this can go in the level of tunability, follow-up work by Austin last year in my group showed that basically using these design guidelines, the ability to make particles that have very precisely tuned regions, and then using that taupe etching chemistry to remove any residual copper sulfide that was purposely put in there kind of as a placeholder that can be removed after the fact. We can make these particles with really tunable gaps. We can make, we can tune protrusions and lengths in different ways and make these really, kind of elaborate anisotropic particles with different semiconductors connected together. And then finally, just to kind of show there's more than meets the eye to some of this, I showed these sequential partial cation exchange reactions that led to heterostructured nanoparticles. This is a 5th generation particle containing zinc sulfide, copper indium sulfide, copper gallium sulfide, cobalt sulfide, and copper sulfide. But if you do effectively that same type of exchange with the same cations simultaneously, where all metal cations are present, in this case with spheres, you end up getting a high entropy solid solution. So when you put everything together at once, you give it the opportunity to all mix, as opposed to temporally separating them through sequential exchange to get the heterostructuring. So there's really a lot of potential here for control and design, both through in scalable systems, but also high levels of complexity that are really shaping the way we're thinking about what's possible in the future. So it was a short talk. I won't, tell you more about what I already told you, but I'll simply say, it's been a pleasure to be part of this special issue. And I showed you our current, probably favorite flavor of transformative inorganic nanoparticle synthesis through cation exchange and partial cation exchange. I highlighted the people that worked on it throughout the talk, and we're grateful to NSF for continued funding of this project through the years. So with that, I'll stop. Hopefully I'm close to on time. And if there's time, I'll be happy to take any questions.
Mm-hmm. So Ray, this is a very fascinating talk, and I think we could take a few questions through the chat window. So Marcus, are there any? Okay.
Okay, looks like we've got one question here. Thank you for such a great talk. From the elemental mapping images, it seems like when the cadmium 2+ ions are cation exchanged into copper 2 sulfide rods, the cadmium 2 ions form along the long axis rather than along the short axis. Is there a specific reason for that?
Yeah, great question. So that comes down to the crystal structure relationships I was mentioning. So, with a partial cadmium exchange, the product is cadmium sulfide, and the lattice constant, if you want to think about it that way, the lattice constant of cadmium sulfide is significantly larger than cobalt sulfide, zinc sulfide, indium sulfide, copper indium sulfide, copper gallium sulfide. So cadmium sulfide is kind of the odd one in that collection of materials in terms of the lattice constants. And it prefers to interface with copper sulfide on a different crystallographic plane. That's the main point. So the other materials will tend to be most epitaxial in this particular crystallographic direction, where cadmium sulfide will prefer to be epitaxial more in that crystallographic direction. So that's just, I think, a beautiful example of how the crystal structure and the atomic relationships really kind of propagate to give that interfacial control. Great question. Thank you.
And just one other question here. Could you transfer this technology to oxide nanocrystals?
Oh, yeah. So there are some great examples of cation exchange and oxides, but they are generally not of the same, I would say. The rates are slower and the capabilities are not quite the same as the sulfides, to put it mildly. They're quite different systems. So I think that would be a frontier to definitely explore. But I think that would be very hard based on what we know now. Just again, based on the diffusion rates of the cations and the structures and the ionicity and all of that. That's probably more common in other chalcogenides and the perovskite, the halide perovskites for anion exchange. And there's other classes of materials that probably have a lot more chance of matching this degree of versatility and scope. But I think oxides would be something worth taking a look at more, for sure.
All right, so the time is up. So maybe Ray, you can answer some of the questions through the chat if
Sure.
there are any more. So let's move to, thank you so much to Ray for great. And let's move to the Sara. And is your slide ready? So Sara, she is a expert in electron tomography for functional nanostructured materials. And she got her degree in physics and currently at physics department at University of Antwerp, Belgium. And she recently won many awards, but one of the awards includes the European Microscopy Society Award in 2020. So Sara, can you go ahead with your talk?
Sure. Can you see my screen and can you hear me all right?
Yeah, I do.
Okay, perfect. Good. So, yeah, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Let me start by thanking the organizers for the initiative and the invitation. And it's really a pleasure to be here together, even though it's only virtual. Now, as you can see, I will be talking about the three-dimensional characterization of nanoparticles using electron tomography. And more precisely, I would like to discuss how we can capture transformations of these nanoparticles using an electron microscope. So this work was indeed part of the special issue, and it was done at EMAT, which is the Electron Microscopy Center at the University of Antwerp in Belgium. So, hold on, let's see, do it like this, yes. So the motivation behind this project is the following. Nanomaterials are consisting of individual atoms, and if we are able to determine the positions of the atoms and their chemical nature and the bonding between them, then we can provide the necessary input to predict their properties. And in this manner, we may even trigger the synthesis of novel nanomaterials. So we will be determining these parameters using electron tomography. And for those not familiar with the technique, I have a small animation here where you will see that if we want to determine the three-dimensional structure of nanomaterials, we will first start by collecting two-dimensional projections of these nano objects, and we hereby use a dedicated electron tomography holder, which in the microscope we will tilt over a tilt range as broad as possible. Images are acquired every other few degrees. This will lead to what we call the tilt series of images. And then these images are aligned with respect to each other, and they serve as an input for a mathematical algorithm that enables us to obtain a three-dimensional reconstruction of the overall morphology, but we can also investigate the inner structure of the nanomaterials, which is illustrated here by these orthoslices. So over the years, we have used electron tomography to investigate a very broad range of materials. And I'm showing you here two examples, an old one and a new one. On the left-hand side, you can see an assembly of gold nanoparticles. And from such a single two-dimensional projection image, it is impossible to determine the number of particles or to measure, for example, interparticle distances. And it is only after applying electron tomography that we can see how nicely these so-called gold nanodumbbells stack together as a three-dimensional puzzle. Then on the right, you see a more recent example, again, a gold nanoparticle. And in this specific study, we were interested in the surface structure of this rod, as it is showing some chiral features. And again, aspects such as chirality or handedness are very difficult or even impossible to determine using any other electron microscopy technique. So using electron tomography, we can clearly investigate the structure of these nanomaterials, but for many years, it was the ultimate dream to also obtain a three-dimensional image at the atomic scale. And so here is my personal journey in the field of high-resolution electron tomography. We started out by performing very simple model-like systems, such as these gold nanorods, and you can see slices through the 3D reconstruction, and we were able to determine which type of crystallographic facets we had at the surface. Then later on, we were also able to investigate the presence of defects, such as this 5-fold twin in this gold nanoparticle, which contains about 90,000 atoms. And for these two examples, we had to exploit some prior information about the system. And what we did is we exploited sparsity at the atomic scale, but more recently, by improving the acquisition and also the alignment of the tilt series, and there is no longer a need to do so. And so all the way on the right, you can see a slice through a three-dimensional reconstruction. Again, two nanorods, and now they are welded together because of a femtosecond laser irradiation. And since we are no longer using any prior information, it is really nice that we can pick up individual defects, such as these dislocations here. And then we could link that to the properties of these systems, as we could see in the plasmon peak, a significant broadening. So electron tomography is a very good technique to investigate the structure of nanomaterials, but we can also combine the concept of electron tomography, for example, with EDX, which stands for Energy Dispersive X-ray Spectroscopy. And on the left, you can see a three-dimensional reconstruction in which every voxel, so voxel is a three-dimensional pixel, contains the ratio between gold and silver. On the right, we have combined electron energy loss spectroscopy, EELS, with tomography, and this is in fact a four-dimensional data set because every voxel now contains a full EELS spectrum. And if we compare this with reference spectra, we can determine the valence in 3 dimensions, and we could reveal in this specific case a core shell structure which is related with the exact type of iron oxide phase present in this nanostar. So these examples have demonstrated that indeed we are able to determine the positions of the atoms in a nanoparticle, and that we can also measure chemical nature and bonding in 3 dimensions. However, we should not forget that all of these measurements have been performed under the conventional conditions of a transmission electron microscope, meaning room temperature and ultra-high vacuum. And those conditions are no longer sufficient if we think about the applications of these nanomaterials, and also when we think about capturing transformation of these nanomaterials. So a next challenge in the field of 3-dimensional characterization using electron microscopy is to again determine these parameters, but now at high temperature, or for example, in the presence of a gaseous environment. And that is exactly the aim behind the Real Nano project. In order to reach this goal, we need to combine in situ electron microscopy with electron tomography. Now, in situ electron microscopy can be performed using a dedicated environmental transmission electron microscope. But unfortunately, in Antwerp, we do not have such a microscope. What we do have is a very broad range of in situ electron microscopy holders. And using these holders, which are typically based on MEMS devices, we can perform heating and cooling experiments. We can apply bias or we can apply strain, and we can also create a specific environment such as a liquid or a gaseous environment. Now that's all great, but unfortunately, performing a three-dimensional characterization using these holders is not a simple method of plug and play. And there are several technical but also fundamental aspects that we need to overcome. Now, one of the most important things is illustrated here. And so this is again the movie on how we acquired the tilt series. And what you see is that we tilt a holder and then there's a small pause. And during this pause, we realign the focus or we put our object back in the field of view. And as a result, even for a trained user, it takes at least an hour or so to collect a full tilt series of images. And 1 hour is simply too long to capture the fast transformations that these nanomaterials will undergo when they're exposed to more realistic conditions. So in order to overcome this challenge, we need to drastically accelerate the acquisition of images. And so therefore, what we are currently doing is we simply leave our holder tilt continuously in a microscope. And rather than capturing images, we are capturing a movie. In order to test the reliability of this approach, we made a comparison, which is illustrated here. So this is again a gold nano dumbbell. On the left, you can see the result after acquiring 49 images conventionally in 1 hour. And on the right, you can see the result of the fast tomography, where 350 images have been acquired in about 6 minutes. You can see that there's a very good agreement between both reconstructions, and that means that the fast tomography is of great interest in the investigation of beam-sensitive materials if you want to improve the throughput of electron tomography, and of course also if you want to capture transformations by combining this approach with in situ electron microscopy. So that is exactly the topic of this study here. We are going to be investigating a gold nanostar. You can see these sharp tips here. They could be important, for example, during catalysis or sensing. And we wanted to understand what is happening to these particles at high reaction temperature or when they would absorb heat because of laser illumination. So the experiment we performed is the following. We start first by performing an electron tomography experiment at room temperature. And we're going to be using a dedicated heating tomography holder. So everything can be done in situ in the electron microscope. Then we're going to heat our sample to 200 degrees Celsius. We keep it there for 30 seconds. We quench and we acquire another fast tomogram. We heat, we quench, and we acquire a fast tomogram. And because these tilt series can now be acquired in 5 minutes or so, we can keep on repeating the process and we can acquire a whole lot of these tilt series and we can actually sample what is happening as a function of heating time. What is happening is very clear. The sharp tips will become blunt and that will definitely influence their properties. We can also repeat this experiment at higher temperature. For example, here at 300 degrees Celsius, we can again see that the sharp tips disappear, in this case even faster. And that is the reason why at 400 degrees, we acquired additional tilt series after 10 and 20 seconds of heating. Then we can go ahead and quantify everything. So on the left, you can see in red where volume is disappearing at the tips and where the volume is growing in green. And if we plot the redistributed volume as a function of heating time, you can see that most of the changes happen in the first minute and a half or so. So keeping that in mind, we performed another experiment where we investigated gold palladium octapods. And now we're going to be looking at one and the same particle. And each time we're going to be changing the temperature. So we start at room temperature, we collect a tomogram. Then we heat to 200 degrees Celsius. We now keep it here for 2 minutes or so, because we know then most of the changes have occurred. We quench, we acquire another fast tomogram, and we heat again, but now to 250 degrees Celsius, and so on and so on. And again, because we can capture the tilt series in a few minutes, we can repeat the process multiple times, and we can map now what is happening as a function of heating temperature. We can again see that the sharp tips are disappearing. They become blunt, and again, that will influence their properties. As we can see here, for example, through these plasmon maps, where we see that the intensity in the plasmon maps decreases, and that is simply because the sharp tips become blunt. We also compared these results to the thermal stability of pure gold octapods, and that is illustrated here for 200 degrees Celsius and 300 degrees Celsius. And in the graph, you can also see indeed that the pure gold octapods in red and blue are much less thermally stable in comparison to the gold palladium. So the palladium really adds to the thermal stability of these systems. Now, these materials also made us wonder, could we do the same type of experiments as I showed you in the introduction of the talk, where we would map the chemical distribution in bimetallic nanoparticles? And the system that we chose to perform these investigations is this one here, gold, silver nanorods. And these images are acquired using what is called high-angle annular dark field scanning transmission electron microscopy. Main idea is that the intensity in the images scales with the atomic number Z squared, more or less. So that is why the gold in the core appears with higher intensity in comparison to the silver in the shell. And this is a relatively old study where we investigated the atomic structure. You can see that again, we are able to reproduce the lattice of the gold and the lattice of the silver. And we also investigated the interface between the core and the shell in more detail by analyzing the intensities, and we could determine the type of crystallographic facets at the interface between core and shell. Now, the reason for investigating the systems at higher temperature is that the tunability of the optical properties it can be varied by changing the shape and the aspect ratio, but also because of the shell thickness. So it's important to understand if at higher temperature this core shell structure remains, yes or no. The answer is very simple. The core shell structure is not maintained, but very quickly a fully alloyed nanoparticle is formed. To investigate this in more detail, we're going to be performing a quantification procedure based on this Z contrast imaging. So in A, you see a slice through a three-dimensional reconstruction obtained at room temperature. And if we look at the distribution of the voxel intensities, you see two peaks, one for gold and one for silver. Now, if we start heating and if we start collecting three-dimensional reconstructions, it is a fair assumption to state that every voxel in one and the same particle should always be a linear combination of the gold and the silver intensity. So this is what is illustrated by these color codes at the bottom. So the experiment we will be performing will be done for these three systems. We have one core shell nanorod, two core shell nanotriangles, and the core shell nanorod and the nanotriangle in the middle have a composition of 60% gold, 40% silver. The nanotriangle on the right has 70% gold. And as you can see from these orthoslices, it's a tiny bit more asymmetric than the middle nanotriangle. So the experiment is the same as before. We're going to heat, in this case, to 450 degrees Celsius. We keep it there for 30 seconds. Then we quench, we acquire a fast tomogram, and then we perform the quantification. We heat, quench, fast tomogram. And so here are slices, quantified slices through the three-dimensional reconstruction. And you can indeed see that we can follow the alloying process. And if we now want to compare between the different systems, this slide is probably easier, because what we will see is that the alloying is very much alike for the nanorod and the symmetric nanotriangle, which suggests that the shape is not so much important. But we see that the alloying for the asymmetric nanorod, which also has slightly different composition, starts much faster. And so that is a motivation to perform these measurements really at such a local scale for different nanoparticles. And we also, because of these subtle changes, performed another study where we have compared 6 different nanosystems. So we have 2 nanocubes, and the nanocubes, they have a different core morphology. There's one type of nanocubes with an octahedral morphology, the other one has a spherical morphology, and so that enables us to understand the role of the type of interfacial facets. Then we have 4 nanorods. Nanorod 1 and 2 are single crystalline. They have a difference in size. And nanorod 3 and 4, they have a pentatwinned core. So nanorod 3 has a rod-like core morphology, and nanorod 4 has a bipyramid morphology. So if we now compare both nanocubes and we made comparison along different crystallographic directions, again, we see that the alloying performs in more or less the same way. So that enables us to conclude that the role of the interfacial facets is not dominant. So next we are comparing the 2 single crystalline nanorods. Again, we see a similar trend, and we conclude that for the sizes in this range, the size does not play a dominant effect. However, if we now compare the single crystalline nanorods to the pentatwinned nanorods, we see that the pentatwinned nanorods start alloying significantly faster. And that is also illustrated here in this table, where all the way at the right, you can see the diffusion constant that we extracted from our measurements. And indeed, the diffusion constant for nanorod 3 and 4, the pentatwinned nanorods, is significantly higher in comparison to all of the other systems. So that is an indication that twin boundaries do play an important role during alloying and during thermal stability. Right, so as I said before, all of these investigations were done using a dedicated in situ tomography heating holder. However, not all of these holders are able to tilt over a tilt interval that is large enough to perform conventional electron tomography. And for example, also these heating investigations have been done at the nanometer level. If we would want to push that to the atomic level, we would need to work on stability issues, both for holders, microscopes, and so on. So for those situations where we cannot apply conventional electron tomography, we need to look at alternatives. And one of these alternatives is 3-dimensional modeling from 2-dimensional images. And so the idea is explained here for a gold nanoparticle sitting on a cerium oxide support. And so in this case here, we only have one image available. And the first step is that we're going to quantify this image. And quantification in Antwerp is the field of expertise of my colleague Sandra van Aert and her team, and they are using what is called statistical parameter estimation theory to determine the positions of the atomic columns and to count the number of atoms in the atomic columns. And so that is what is indicated by these color codes here. Then we use these results as an input for molecular dynamic simulations. And then we can come up with a 3-dimensional model based on our 2-dimensional image. You can see that we are able to determine the type of crystallographic facets. And so this is the approach that we have used to understand transformations for the supported gold nanoparticles. And we made a comparison between room temperature and 500 degrees Celsius. On the left and in the middle, we have 2 different nanoparticles, but with sort of similar sizes. And what we see if we make a comparison between room temperature and high temperature is that we see that the shape of the individual surface facet changes. But then if we look at the coordination numbers, which we also extracted, we cannot see a really significant difference. However, if we now look at the particle on the right, which is significantly smaller, we can see that we start with a flat particle At higher temperature, it becomes more rounded. This can be seen in the 3D reconstruction and is also reflected by the increase of coordination number 12, which corresponds to the bulk atoms, indeed indicating a rounder shape. Also, in the very last example that I want to share with you today, the three-dimensional modeling from 2D images was used. These are now platinum nanoparticles. They're in a gas cell holder. This holder does not enable us to tilt sufficiently for conventional electron tomography. And you also see that the contrast in this image is not as good as other images that I've shown. And the reason is simply that we are working in a gas. Think about driving in the fog. So first we're gonna collect a series of images and we're gonna correct for distortions, ending up with an image from which we can again count a number of atoms. Again, we're going to be using this as an input for molecular dynamics simulations, and that allows us to compare the structure of these particles in vacuum with the structure of these particles in hydrogen and oxygen. And we went back and forth between hydrogen and oxygen, and we could also see a transition between a faceted nanoparticle and a rounded nanoparticle. We can again quantify this, and we could see that if we perform some sort of cycling investigation, that at a given point, the higher order index facets start decreasing. And that obviously is important if later on people would want to use these particles during catalysis. And so with that, I come to the conclusions. I have shown you that we are able to determine the positions of the atoms in a nanoparticle and that we can measure chemical nature and bonding in 3D. And nowadays, we are also able to track heat-induced changes in morphology, but also in composition. And we can perform investigation of the three-dimensional nanoparticle dynamics in a gaseous environment. With that, I would like to thank the entire team in Antwerp, all of the researchers, all of the members of the technical staff, all of my colleagues for the hard work behind this presentation. I would like to thank the people that I collaborate with all over the world. I would like to thank the financial institutions, and of course, I would like to thank you for your attention.
Wow, Sara, thank you so much. Great talk. Are there any questions or comments? Eric, do you see anything in the chat window? Okay, I don't. Okay, so then maybe I can. This is a beautiful talk. I can just ask a quick question to you. You worked on the metals and gold, palladium, alloys, and so on. And then you show that the hydrogenation and oxidation of those metals are very important, especially in the Fawcett reaction and so on. And how do you correlate it with the catalytic effects? Do you see any dissociation of hydrogen or oxidation reduction? And
yeah, so that's
yeah.
It's a very exciting question. What we wanted to do with the platinum nanoparticles is kind of establish the methodology. Like, can we measure the changes in the facets? But now, indeed, we are moving to actual catalytic reactions. And we also have a mass spectrometer that we can connect to the gas cell holder, where we can then measure the activity and try to link that to the three-dimensional structure of these nanoparticles. That is my ultimate dream. And so such investigations indeed are ongoing. These are like really complex investigations, and investigations where you say, you know, like now I'm gonna spend an entire week or maybe month at a microscope making sure that all of the parameters are right and that the experiment can be performed. So yes, these are things that we are currently working on. and where hopefully we will have sufficient results to show at conferences. Yeah, so it's work in progress. Let's put it like that.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, that sounds great. Any other comments? If not, please join me to thank Sara, and then let's move on to the next talk. All right, great.
Thank you.
And the next speaker is from EPFL, Raffaella Buonsanti. She is a very well-known chemistry and interface of nanomaterials, and especially for electrocatalysis. And I think one of her interested on CO2 reduction. And then she has done many great work, and of course there are accolades and honors. And I think one of the latest one is the her winning Swiss Chemical Society Vernon Prize this year, 2021. So I'd like to congratulate for her, and let's welcome Raffaella for her talk.
Yeah, I was still muted, so thank you very much for the introduction, and also for the invitation to this journal club. And today, so now we will go back to the synthesis part, and we will be looking into the chemical transformations which are behind the formation of copper nanocrystals. And what I will show you is that if we get a better understanding of how nanocrystals form, we can also control them better and eventually learn how to make more selective catalysts to reduce CO2. So one of the current challenges in nanochemistry is that synthesis by design is still not possible. Ray actually has shown the beautiful example on the chalcogenides, where through cation exchange reaction, we can access a large library of compounds. However, as soon as we start moving towards underexplored classes of materials, which include, for example, non-noble metals or complex oxides, which were also mentioned, we are still quite in the dark in terms of synthesis. And the point is that these materials are those often required for application. Now, why synthesis by design is still challenging? So what we know when we start in a flask with metal precursor and organic ligands is that we form nanocrystals, and then the organic ligands help to control the shape by preferentially binding to certain crystal facets. And then we're mostly relying still on the Lamer diagram, based on which these metal precursor and organic ligands somehow form monomers. Then when we reach the critical limiting supersaturation, nucleation occur, and then eventually growth. But the truth is that we have very little idea of what these monomers are. We also have little idea of how the precursor evolve into the monomers, and generally, what are the chemical transformation behind the formation of nanocrystals. And I do believe that it's because of this reason that retrosynthesis of nanocrystals still does not exist. So we cannot really define which precursors and which ligands and the conditions that we have to use to eventually reach our target product. And this is the reason why Ray was mentioning earlier today that we might need a few years to learn how to synthesize new compounds. So our approach to tend to move and to make some progress towards retrosynthesis is to look for intermediates. So what does it form between the metal precursor and organic ligands and the final nanoparticles? And what us and others also are finding is that these intermediates can really have different chemical nature. They can be molecular clusters, or they can be coordination polymer, or even secondary nanoparticles forming in situ. So to characterize these intermediates, we really need a miscellany of different techniques, which span from mass spectrometry and NMR to then X-ray and electron microscopy, and often we also need DFT calculation. And furthermore, it is desirable if these techniques are applied in situ while we run the synthesis, because many of these intermediates might be metastable. But then one might argue, well, if we have to go through all these efforts, why just not to accept that materials chemistry is a black box and we just need to mix, shake, and bake? So I will give you basically in my talk 2 examples where I will show that if we understand what are the reaction intermediates, we can eventually improve the synthesis design and then learn how to improve the tunability of existing materials, or also discovering new materials eventually. And this is helpful because it contributes to address challenges in our case, our interest is catalysis and energy research. In particular, as it was mentioned also in the introduction, we are interested in the conversion of CO2. So the idea between electrochemical conversion of CO2 is to store energy into chemical bonds. So we have excess electricity from renewable, then we have CO2 and water, and ideally, it is possible to produce all the chemicals, many of the chemicals which are nowadays extracted from petroleum and are essential to build materials or as fuels, or also for agrochemicals, for example. One of the aspects which is separating us from making this a reality is actually to find a catalyst, which is selective to break the bonds of CO2 and water and eventually selectively form this product. Why this is not easy? This is not easy because actually the CO2 reduction pathway is quite complex. Now here I've illustrated the many different pathways which can lead to products like methane, ethylene, and ethanol. And of course, this picture here, the purpose is not for you to being able to look into all these intermediates, but just to have an idea of the complexity. Now, this comes from theory, and now experimental evidences are trying to pinpoint to what are the most important intermediates. So far, we know that, for example, the formation of CO is important, as well as the formation of the CHO for the production of methane, and eventually that cis coupling must occur to form ethylene. Now, if we plot on this graph the binding energy of 2 of the intermediates that I've just mentioned, namely CHO and CO, what we observe is that, and here we have surfaces of different metals. So what we observe is that metals such as silver and gold, they don't bind CO too strongly. And so the CO2 is actually reduced up to CO, and then CO leaves the surface. So silver and gold are very good catalysts for CO production. Copper is special because it has this intermediate binding energy, which allows the reaction to proceed past CO. Other metals, they bind CO too strongly, and so eventually they get poisoned. Now, the problem is that if one takes copper foil, the 16 different products are going to be produced, and this will be a separation nightmare. A Japanese researcher, which is, has become quite famous by now, which is Ori, he performed studies on single crystals, and what he found is that there is a structure-dependent selectivity of this reaction. In particular, that the 100 facet of copper produces more selectively ethylene, and the 111 surface produces methane. Now, normally, these studies on single crystals are performed in conditions which are not actually close to the actual conditions in which a device operates, and furthermore, a single crystals cannot be implemented basically in an electrolyzer. So what we thought was, okay, why don't we make copper nanocrystals as cubes and as octahedra in order to learn if we can translate these discoveries from single crystal studies into more realistic conditions, and see also if we can learn something more about the size dependence of this reaction. Now, it turns out that while we have a huge library of noble metal nanoparticles, things starts to be a bit more complicated and a bit more limited in terms of shape control for non-noble metal nanoparticles. And the problem is that most of the chemistry for metal nanoparticles has been developed in water, and non-noble metal nanoparticles will oxidize in water. So we have to start thinking more about synthesis in organic solvent, and we need to start learning how to develop it in order to shape non-noble metal and copper. So we started actually with two hints from the literature, which indicated that the synthesis of copper bromide and oleoylamine in the presence of triethylphosphine forms spheres, and the synthesis of in the presence of triethylphosphine oxide forms cubes. Of course, we could have stopped here and just say that this is because the triethylphosphine and the triethylphosphine oxide binds differently to different facets of copper. But this time we really wanted to learn more about the chemical transformation behind the formation of copper particles. And so we built a flask which really resembles the flask that we use in the lab, and we went to the synchrotron to perform in situ X-ray studies. And here, this is the temperature profile of the synthesis. So there is a plateau, heating ground plateau, and we did studies these 3 steps using in situ X-ray absorption, but also complemented with other ex situ techniques. And to make a long story short, what we learn is that actually the main role of the triethylphosphine oxide and triethylphosphine is to complex copper. And the rate of these two complexes, they disproportionate at different rate. And furthermore, the disproportionation occurs at different temperature. Because of these, they generate a higher copper monomer flux in the case of the copper zero flux, in the case of the complex with TOPO, which establishes a kinetic regime, and we form nanocubes. In the case of the complex with the triethylphosphine, we have a lower copper zero flux, which establishes a thermodynamic regime, and we obtain spherical nanoparticles. Now, having learned that what matters here is the disproportionation rate of these complexes, we were able basically to control the rate of disproportionation and play with the injection modality, the injection temperature, injecting the pre-synthesized complexes, basically. And we were able to synthesize spheres of different sizes, cubes of different sizes, octahedra of different sizes, and also to access tetrahedra that had not been synthesized up to now. We were now ready to test these nanocubes for CO2 reduction and to learn about their behavior. Here, what I'm reporting is the Faraday efficiency, which indicates how many electrons are converted into certain products. And here, the black line is the hydrogen that is produced, because the hydrogen evolution reaction will always be competing with the CO2 reduction reaction, is kinetically more favorable. And here you can see that actually the 44 nanometer cubes, they are producing less hydrogen and much more ethylene compared to the other sizes. So what we expected actually was that as we got closer to the single crystal, so to extended 100 surface, we will observe more ethylene eventually. And this is not what we found. So what we found is actually that there is an optimal size. And we found a similar behavior also with the octahedra, where actually smaller sizes of octahedra were only producing hydrogen. Instead, we found an optimal size for the octahedra being around in the range between, again, 50 and 80 nanometer. So now what changes when we change size is, of course, the surface to volume ratio, but this does not explain our findings. What instead changes is the ratio between planes. It's basically the ratio between the terraces and the steps, the terraces and the steps. And so basically, these, what we found with the copper nanocubes and with the copper octahedra does confirm the selectivity of the 100 preferentially for ethylene and of the 111 preferentially for methane. But at the same time, we highlight that it is important to have these terraces together with the edges, which are step sites on single crystals, which contribute to selectivity. And the way in which they contribute to selectivity is basically by favoring CC coupling. So the 100 facet, basically, they favor the absorption of CO, and then these edges, they favor the CC coupling, which leads to ethylene formation. One thing I would like to highlight is also that while these first studies were performed into still ideal conditions, we were also able to translate this performance at high current density. So because these nanocrystals, they come as HINC, we can also integrate them in what is referred to as a carbon felt. So this is a gas diffusion electrode. So we can basically feed CO2 as a gas. And the currents that I'm reporting here this time are commercially relevant current density. And we do find that the selectivity of our particles is also preserved at this high current density. And now, more recently, we have also started basically to utilize these shaped nanocrystals to interrogate in a quite unique way to interrogate reaction pathway, which I mentioned earlier that they are quite complex. So in particular, for example, if we want to form ethanol, because now we can form methane, we can form ethylene, what about alcohols, which are also desirable product to obtain? In terms of theory, there have been reported two pathways for alcohols. In one case, they suggest that alcohols form via CO-CO coupling. Other researchers suggest that instead alcohols forms via CO-CH coupling. And the way in which we try to address this question is by combining copper cubes and copper octahedra with silver. This scheme is referred to as a tandem catalysis because here the silver produces CO. I mentioned that silver and gold are highly selective for CO, so silver produces CO, and it creates basically an enhanced local concentration of CO around the copper cubes and the copper octahedra. What we found here is that the copper octahedra were actually becoming, in the presence of enhanced local concentration of CO, highly selective for ethanol compared to the copper cubes that instead remain selective for ethylene. And this finding actually suggests that the formation of ethanol occurs via CO-CH coupling because the octahedra, for the fact that they are selective for methane, possess a surface which is enriched in CH intermediate, which then react with the CO and eventually generate ethanol. So this was basically the first story that I wanted to share with you, where we did look into the type of intermediate. So we tried to understand the chemistry which is behind the formation of nanocrystals. We discovered that these ligands, they do react with the precursor, they form clusters. And is the molecular complexes. And is the disproportionation rate of these molecular complexes that eventually matters in determining the growth regime. And learning this, we could access different shapes of nanocrystals and demonstrate that facet ratio controls selectivity in CO2 reduction. And in a more broader context, I also would like to highlight that the formation of these molecular complexes, clusters as intermediate in nanocrystal synthesis, is also has also been reported in different for different materials such as metal oxide or also indium phosphide. So these are emerging as common intermediates in nanocrystal synthesis. But now I also want to share you this other story where the intermediates are organic, inorganic compounds, are these polymer lamella. So basically here we were looking at the synthesis of these copper spheres. In this case, we have copper acetylacetate, triethylamine is used as a solvent, and also it does contribute to reduction. And then we have the tetradecyl phosphonic acid, again, supposedly as a ligand. And there is a similar temperature profile where we have a plateau, a heating ramp, and a plateau, and we form these copper nanospheres. Again, to make a long story short, what we found here using this time was in situ X-ray diffraction and in situ X-ray small angle X-ray scattering using a similar reaction flask as the one that I showed before. What we found is that actually in this case, the TDPA reacts with the copper to form a layered copper phosphonate chain. So we form a polymer lamella. And then what happens to this polymer lamella is that as soon as the temperature increases, it suddenly transitions to a micellar structure, and then eventually the copper plus gets reduced to copper 0, and we form the particles. And so we suggest here that these polymer lamella are acting as concentration hotspot for the copper atomic species, and they cause a burst of nucleation and eventually the formation of these monodispersed particles. Now, having learned that these polymer lamella are actually the active species behind, are the intermediates behind the synthesis of these copper nanoparticles, what we did was to synthesize the polymer lamella and to use them as directly in the flask to change the concentration to obtain these highly monodispersed spheres, which were which possessed highly monodispersity compared to a previously reported procedure. And why is important? Why monodispersity is important? Well, it turned out actually this is important if we want to study how these particles might change also during electrochemistry. We were basically intrigued by a work reported in the literature where it was demonstrated that these small copper particles at a specific loading evolve into cubes. And so eventually, I did not specify before, but these small copper particles with a large fraction of under-coordinated sites, they are somehow more active for hydrogen. So here the authors demonstrated that they evolve into cubes, and we got intrigued by the structural transformation because we wanted to understand how this actually happened. And so in collaboration with my colleague in the materials chemistry, in the material science department, Vaso Tileli, we performed some in situ electron microscopy in liquid. Of course, this has nothing to do with the beautiful images that Sara showed, but it's also more complicated because we are applying a bias. There is a liquid layer. And so the only thing you can see here is that during electrochemistry, these particles become bigger. And we could study taking snapshot how these particles become bigger, and what we were able to find is that the particles evolve into bigger particles not via sintering, which is most commonly observed in different reactions, but they do occur to a unique dissolution reprecipitation reaction. And we're now in the process of identifying these transient copper species, which will be interesting to learn more about them in order to be eventually able to direct reconstructions while we perform electrochemistry. So this is the second story that I wanted to share with you, where we did find that intermediates are this coordination polymer, and we suggest that this coordination polymer act as hotspot and therefore allow to obtain a burst of nucleation and eventually monodispersed particles. And then we were able to use this highly monodispersed particle to study how size distribution changes during CO2 reduction and eventually identify this dissolution reprecipitation mechanism. And again, I would like to highlight the fact that these organic-inorganic mesophases as intermediates in nanocrystal synthesis have also been reported for cadmium selenide nanostructure, so might be more common than one might think. And what about next? Well, compared to what has been the rich variety that has been, of shapes that has been reported for FCC noble metals, we are really far behind in the case of copper. So the next step is to continue to play with the chemistry that we have learned and eventually to maybe obtain hollow nanostructures. So where we have only edges, this will be quite interesting for the catalytic studies, as well as to access other shapes with high index facets. Then, of course, it will be also interesting to move towards other non-noble metal nanocrystals, considering that they are quite interesting for catalysis, but also for magnetic properties, or also as alternative plasmonic materials, some of them. And then eventually multimetallic non-noble metal nanocrystals. As I mentioned, we are interested in catalysis. Nevertheless, many of these materials have application for plasmonic or magnetic properties and eventually batteries, if we consider, of course, everything that is beyond noble metal. And with this, I would like to acknowledge the students in my group, postdoc, of course, also alumni, collaborators, which I mentioned, whose name were their name were in the slides related to the work that I shared with you today, fundings and facilities, and you for your attention.
Wow, great talk, and it was beautiful. Are there any comments or questions from the audience? I think we can take probably one. I think your talk was great. And can I? Are there any? Okay, can I ask one? So it seems like the process is very important, and also the choice of copper is remarkable because I mean, you could easily replace noble metals with copper or other transition metals. That's pretty amazing. But they tend to be easily oxidized. For example, you show that the copper has surrounded by active intermediate organic molecules containing, for example, oxygen or sulfur and amine and so on. Then it will change the surface state of the metals. But I mean, your work seems to be convincing enough that it is really indeed happening. So how do you characterize the real surface state of the metals, for example, copper?
Yeah, no, it's a good point. Of course, yeah, one of the issues with copper is that it gets easily oxidized. Now, one thing to consider is that during the electrochemical CO2 reduction, we apply highly negative potential. So basically at minus 1.1 volt versus RHE, all the copper is metallic. And so even if you do have, you might have some, because of course we work in a glove box, and when we prepare the particles, they are metallic copper. So we do XPS, or also in situ, also for the electrochemistry, we do in situ X-ray absorption spectroscopy. And so in the moment in which you immerse the electrodes in water at open circuit voltage, you will observe certain degree of a certain fraction of copper if the particles are small enough, because of course the absorption is not a surface sensitive technique. So if it's small enough, you will observe some oxide. But then eventually, as the reaction proceeds, it will be metallic copper because of the extremely negative potential that you apply. However, we do find that the oxide will play a crucial role, and maybe the intermediates, as you mentioned, is exactly what we are finding in this copper transient species, in the reconstruction. There are some complexes involved with the oxygen-based oxygen-containing species. So it is, yeah, I think it plays a role then in the eventual reconstruction that happens during catalysis. So at some point, it will be beautiful if we could image this in 3D as develop technique in liquid. So even an extra challenge for her.
Yeah, that would be wonderful. Yeah, this is a great work, and then we are looking forward to your future work. That should be very, very exciting. Yeah, thank you so much, Raffaella, for great talk again. And then let's move on to our last speaker. The Liberato Manna. He was actually one of our guest editors leading this special issue along with Ray. So he group of eminent chemists in nano materials, chemists, especially in the topic of transformative matter and matter oxide and matter chalcogenide nanocrystals. So he made this special issue really possible. And he is currently a director of the deputy director of the Italian Institute of Technology, and also the senior researcher over there. And he has amazing career, and I'll just show you some examples, and I think he is a fellow of RSC, and he has a highly cited researchers and so on. But I think this is probably important one, the Sacconi Medal in Inorganic Chemistry. So that tells you that he is one of the leaders in the field. So please join me to welcome Liberato, and here we expect.
Thank you for the nice invitation. I'm going to be talking about perovskite nanocrystals today. These are formed by networks of corner-sharing lead halide octahedra stabilized by large cations. In these materials, it's very hard to find defects. The only low-energy defects are vacancies. But as you can see in panel actually B, contrary to traditional semiconductors, these vacancies, which form unsaturated bonds, lead to states which are nested in the valence and in the conduction band. So they're not so detrimental for the optical properties. Polarons are also forming in perovskites, which contribute to decreasing of carrier-carrier scattering and long carrier lifetime, which is responsible for high photovoltaic efficiency in solar cells. You can change the optical properties of perovskites by changing, for example, A cations and X anion. And with nanocrystals, you can tune the sites and also reach the quantum confinement regime in these materials. Now, nanocrystals were initially made with ligands that were prone to detachment because they could easily be protonated or deprotonated. But lately, people have started using zwitterions, for example, which are more tightly bound to the surface of nanocrystals, or quaternary ammonium halide ions, which cannot lose the positive charge, and so they remain tightly bound to the surface of the nanocrystals. So here are two examples from our group on using Ligand Exchange to replace the native ligands on the surface of nanocrystals with these more stably bound ligands like dimethyl ammonium bromide, which leads to nanocrystals with quantum yield of 100% and stability for many weeks. What you see below is alloy of cadmium and lead based perovskites. And if you don't do this ligand exchange, the cadmium atoms leak out of the nanocrystals through the vacancies, halide vacancies, and the color of the nanocrystals shifts from blue to green. If instead you do this ligand exchange, the nanocrystals color of emission is preserved over time. So you see that it's very important to actually prevent some of the transformations in these materials. Here you see a panel of all the possible type of transformations that you can do on perovskite nanocrystals. You can do an ion exchange, and so tune the band gap. You can do B-cation exchange, and so, for example, dope nanocrystals with manganese and get also orange emission. You can change the A cation, and so stabilize or destabilize the nanocrystal structure, and also change a little bit the band gap. And you can do also all these transformative reactions in which, for example, lead bromide or cesium bromide is inserted or extracted from the nanocrystals, and you can go all the way from, for example, cesium bromide to cesium lead bromide to cesium 4 lead bromide 6. Now, let's look a little bit more detail at some of these reactions. So, for example, cesium 4 lead bromide 6 nanocrystals are insulators because they are formed by isolated lead halide 4, for example, lead bromide 6, octahedra. So, for example, if you make nanocrystals of different sizes, the optical absorption is always the same. Okay, there is no quantum confinement effect. It's a high band gap material, but then you can use this to form a perovskite by intercalating lead bromide, for example. And as you can see, the size of the nanocrystal is preserved, although there is a change in the crystal structure. You can also do very interesting reactions. So, for example, you can react 3D perovskites with an amine. This amine will basically form a complex with lead bromide. So we'll suck it out from the perovskite lattice, forming the 0D phase. And this is a reaction that occurs at basically room temperature. So this is a film exposed to vapors of a butylamine. So butylamine is extract lead bromide, and you form a 0D phase, which is an insulator. And you can do the same reaction back by heating up this film. So butylamine is released into the atmosphere, and you get a reinsertion of lead bromide into the perovskite phase. You can do something more complicated. You can make a film of nanocrystals irradiate with X-ray certain region of a film, for example, as you see in panel B or here. The regions which have been irradiated by X-rays, marked with this red circle here, become refractory to these reactions because the ligands are basically forming a sort of protecting layer because they have been cross-linked by this radiation damage. And so when you expose the film to the butylamine vapor, the irradiated regions, they are not transformed. They remain in the 3D perovskite because butylamine cannot enter it. And the non-irradiated region convert into the 0 phase, the 0D phase. You can heat the film and go back basically to the, almost entirely to the original PL emission, also from the non-exposed phase. So you see, this is an interesting effect of chemical transformations on these perovskite nanocrystals, which are materials that are very, very much prone to different sets of chemical reactions. So, for example, another typical reaction you can do on a perovskite is extraction of cesium bromide, actually starting from the cesium 4 lead bromide 6. Now, for example, if you get poisoned by cesium 137, which is strongly radioactive, doctors will give you pills of Prussian blue. Okay, so this is a very small metal organic framework, and the sides of the cage fits exactly the sides of the cesium ions. So if you put, for example, the 0D cesium 4 lead bromide 6 nanocrystals in contact with Prussian blue, it will extract cesium and, of course, bromide ion as a counter cation, counter anion. The transformation, it's not as easy as just, from a single nanocrystal, you remove a fraction of the cesium bromide. It's sort of redissolution, recrystallization kind of reaction. You can do this transformation of cesium 4 lead bromide 6 into the perovskite also in a more careful way. So for example, you can take a polymer, so a polyanhydride polymer, for example, and what happens in this case is that the polymer, the anhydride group will react with the ligands on the surface of the nanocrystals and with also some of the free amines present in the solution of the nanocrystals. They will strip completely the ligands and also acidify the medium. And these conditions basically lead to the extraction of bromide ions and of cesium ions, which are complexed by the polymer. And you have this transformation into the 3D phase. This transformation is gradual in this case, so you can actually capture the transformation of the nanocrystals at the intermediate stages. And what we find here is basically that these structures are epitaxial, and the epitaxy is given by the continuation of the cesium cation framework. Another similar transformation is the synthesis of perovskite nanocrystals starting from cesium halide. Okay, and why in this case, we show the example of cesium bromide. So for example, you start from cesium bromide nanocrystals of different sizes, you react them with a solution of lead olate, and you get, starting from the surface of the nanocrystals, a partial cesium to lead cation exchange, which continues all the way to the center of the nanocrystal, transforming them into perovskites. Okay, again here, this is not simple as it is. There is also some etching of the nanocrystal involved, but again, it's a nice partial transformation that starts from the surface and converts initial nanocrystals into another metal halide lattice. Now, the way we can put together all these reactions, and this is actually the topic of 2 papers, of which one is an account, is to imagine all these nanocrystals not from the point of view of the network of lead halide, octahedra or polyhedra, but simply from the from a cage of cesium ions, which have at their interior either halide ions, as in the case of cesium halide, okay, so let's say cesium bromide, and then all the way to cesium lead to bromide 5, for example. Okay, when you go from this transformation to all these other transformation, what you're doing is keep inserting lead bromide, neutral lead bromide into the cages, and the bromide initially present in the cages also reorganizes. So, for example, in the case of cesium 4 lead bromide 6, 1/4 of the cages ends up filled with the lead bromide 6 polyanion, and all the other cages are empty. They do not contain any halide. If you keep adding lead bromide, you end up forming cesium lead bromide 3, and now each cesium cage is filled by lead bromide 3 polyion, and then you can continue and adding even more lead bromide and forming cesium lead bromide lead 2 bromide 5, in which single cesium cage is filled by lead 2 bromide 5 polyion. And now, indeed, you can also see now all the transformation we have been seeing so far, and also reported by other groups in the literature, as based on this preservation of the cesium cation sublattice. So, for example, the cesium bromide, cesium lead bromide core shell structure I've shown you before can be seen under this slide. The cesium lead bromide 3, cesium 4 lead bromide 6 also. And this type of heterostructure, which has not actually been reported on nanocrystals, but on bulk films. Also here, you can form an epitaxial interface, but only along a certain crystallographic directions, because along other directions, the size of the cage is too large to accommodate for any strain. Now, I've been talking so far of let's say, transformation in perovskite nanocrystals, but in reality, what people want to do is, well, they study this transformation, but then they study means to avoid this transformation, okay? So, for example, you want to avoid that the perovskite degrade, and we know that perovskite degrade under moisture, for example, but with also by reacting with other chemical reagents. So what we did recently was to grow perovskite nanocrystals inside the pores of mesoporous silica, and used a molten salt mixture as a solvent. This is not entirely new, but we, previous to us, this was done only at very high temperature, around 700 degrees. We managed to do this growth at 350 degrees. And also we got, let's say, mesoporous silica embedding nanocrystals at their interior. And the reaction conditions are also such that the external walls of this mesoporous silica are collapsed. So the nanocrystals are entirely encased into this mesoporous silica. And the proof is that you can take this composite and throw them in aqua region for 70 days. And the nanocomposite, you still see emission from the nanocomposite. So they're completely sealed from the external environment. And then, of course, what you can do out of these materials, it's lighting application. So we tested both on-chip application in which our silica and nanocrystal composites were embedded in PDMS together with a standard red emitting phosphor. And they were placed, this film was placed on top of a blue emitting LED, and so you get a warm light LED. Another application we tested, that this is done in collaboration with Quantum Solutions, is again a blend of two emitters. So our composite and the standard red emitter, together also with titanium dioxide as a scattered, in a polymer curable IBOA. And also we got white light emission. Now, another more interesting approach, which was just published by us, it's a nanocrystal encased in a micelles made of polyacrylic acid and block polystyrene. Okay, this synthesis is done by ligand assisted reprecipitation approach. And together with the polymer and the precursor for the nanocrystals, we also add a set of additive molecules which improve the compatibility between the polymer and the nanocrystal. Now, this polymer, this block of polymer is such that the core it's a polyacrylic acid, and the outer shell, it's a polystyrene. And now it comes the interesting thing that depending on whether the solvent in which this polymer encased nanocrystals are dispersed, whether this is, for example, toluene, relatively non-polar, or methanol, you can switch on or off an ion exchange. So for example, in toluene, you can take nanocrystals and you can add, for example, iodine precursors, and immediately the anion exchange gets triggered. Whereas when they are in methanol, the anion exchange is completely suppressed. This is because in one case, the outer shell is in a globule state, and so it makes anions, the core inaccessible to the anions. In the other case, the polymer is in the coil state, and so the nanocrystals are accessible. This is the same thing, but starting from cesium lead bromide and adding a chloride additive. And you see again that in toluene you trigger easily an ion exchange, whereas in methanol this is completely suppressed. You can also try to attempt an ion exchange in methanol, for example, and you will see that this is not occurring, okay, because the polymer is in the global state. But then as soon as you add toluene to this flask, you will switch the polymer from the globule to the coil state. And what will happen is that an ion exchange is triggered. You will see now that toluene is added, and you see now that the color of emission shifts now from green to blue. Okay, so now you can make powders of these nanocrystals, for example. You can ground them simply by a mortar and pestle and mix them together. When the powders are dry, the polymer is in the global state, so there is no inter-nanocrystal anion exchange. So this mixture of powder preserves their color of emission, the multicolor of emission over months. You can do something even better. Now, in this case, we made the cesium from amylinium lead halide nanocrystals. In the case of the bromide, this is corresponding to exactly the green emission from the powder. Then we use them, part of them, to make an ion exchange, so to generate the blue and the red components. And in all these cases, then the final nanocrystals, the dried powder, were mixed with the polymethyl methacrylate, dried and ball milled to achieve an extremely fine powder. And so you can mix this very fine powder and get a white emitting powder, and use this white emitting powder to build a layer for a down converting light emitting diodes. Okay, now you have basically a film which is white emitting, and it's completely made of perovskite nanocrystals, and the excitation source can be easily now just a UV lamp, okay, as shown in this device architecture here. And by this you get again a warm light emitting diode. So this is the color of emission of these three separate powders, and this is the color of emission from the resulting film that you see here. Okay. Now, still looking on ways to prevent somehow transformations in nanocrystals, we take a slight detour now and look into lead-4 sulfur-3 bromide 2. This is a chalco halide. These nanocrystals were recently discovered by us. They have a phase which does not correspond to any known bulk phase. And so to solve the crystal, they have an indirect band gap and basically no emission. And to solve the crystal structure of these materials, we had to combine 3D electron diffraction from single nanocrystals. Also, we, with the help of the group of the Sara Bals, we did scanning transmission electron microscopy on single nanocrystals, and we basically we did tomography, and we reconstructed the whole reciprocal lattice. The nanocrystal damaged somehow during this acquisition, but we were still able to recover the lattice parameter and basically the size of the cell, which matched very nicely with that from 3D electron diffraction. But anyway, without going into detail, we were able to figure out the structure of these nanocrystals. which by themselves are not very interesting if it weren't for the fact that we were able recently to grow heterostructures out of these materials with perovskite. So the synthesis is a little bit elaborate. We start from pre-synthesized clusters of halide perovskites, and we inject into these pre-synthesized clusters all what is needed to nucleate and grow the chalco halide. You end up forming this beautiful heterostructure where the brighter domain now in stem is the chalco halide. The optical absorption features of these chalco halides look very similar to those of the perovskite. In addition, there is the tail due to the chalco halide. The residual PL, very weak PL coming from this sample, is most likely just due to residual isolated nanocrystals of perovskite, because in reality what we have seen and we have been able to demonstrate, when you grow these heterostructures, you completely quench the PL from the perovskite domain. Okay, now what can be done with this? Well, first of all, with Sara Bals, we did advanced stem analysis on these nanocrystals. We also did a lot of quantitative analysis. Sara has been showing some of this. We basically were able to demonstrate very nicely the epitaxial relationship between the perovskite domain and the chalco halide domain. We could even identify the continuation of the lead cation sublattice going from the perovskite to the chalco halide domain. And what you see in this image, maybe it's summarized more easily here. So this is the side view, and this is a top view of the heterostructure, looking only at the lead cation framework. And you would see actually that the lattice of the lead framework of the chalco halide has this zigzag pattern, and this plane here belongs at the same time to the perovskite and, sorry, to the chalco halide and to the perovskite. So there is a perfect epitaxial match along this direction. Now, this perfect epitaxial match generate this very nice epitaxial heterostructure. We also tried to perform an ion exchange on these heterostructures. And interesting enough, although quite expected, an ion exchange occurs only in the perovskite domain. So the chalco halide domain remains bromide in composition from the point of view of the halide. And also the two heterostructures, the two new heterostructures are completely epitaxial. And again, there is a quenching of the PL. Now, what you can do out of this heterostructure? Well, you know, if you synthesize cesium, okay, this grows in the orthorhombic gamma phase, but this phase is very unstable at room temperature. So if you make just isolated nanocrystals of this perovskite material basically in a few days, it will transition in this non-perovskite phase made by chains, one-dimensional chains of edge sharing octahedra. Instead, when you do the heterostructure, because now there is a very nice epitaxial match between the perovskite and the chalco halide, the perovskite structure is locked in place, and it doesn't go any transition to the delta phase. So this can be used, for example, in photovoltaic devices, for example, in any other devices where you don't want this transition to occur. And now, just very quickly, of course, you can stop this, you can prevent this transition to occur from the perovskite phase to the non-perovskite phase also by other means. So for example, here in this work of 2017, we alloyed, we introduced 10% of, we replaced 10% of lead with manganese. Manganese is a smaller ionic radius than lead. This decreases the overall size of the cage and makes the cesium cation large enough to stabilize this new cage. Because the overall reason for this transition from the perovskite to the non-perovskite phase is that the cesium, is the lead iodide cage is too large for the cesium to stabilize it. So either you alloy cesium with other larger A cations, so for example, methylammonium, or you reduce the size of the cage by alloying lead with manganese, and this is what we did. Now, maybe the most important thing is that alloying with the manganese does not change at all the optical features of the nanocrystals compared to the cesium lead iodide pure nanocrystals. But here you see the very big difference. Just standard cesium lead iodide, well, here it's indicated alpha phase cubic. They undergo transition to the non-perovskite phase in just 5 days, whereas the alloyed nanocrystals do not undergo transition even after 1 month. Just a slight fraction is transformed. And then also, the alloying with manganese increases the cohesive energy, so stabilizes the energy, the overall energy of the nanocrystals, and also manganese introduce orbit states which are either very high or very low compared to the band edges. So in the density of state, there is no much contribution of manganese states in the gap or the band edges, and this is why basically they optically behave as the standard cesium lead iodide nanocrystals. So with this, I finished my presentation. I thank all these people and different groups, funding agencies, and you for the attention.
Great, wonderful talk, and this is a very, comprehensive discussion on the perovskite nanocrystal. I think it was really good. Any questions, comments? Maybe Ray or Raffaella, Sara, or anyone, someone from the audience? All right. Then if not, let me. I mean, you give a remarkable talk. I have one general question or comment on the perovskite nanocrystals. It's a very simple question. So I mean, it seems like you can really stabilize perovskite nanocrystals whether you have a black copolymers coating, and or you can embed it into porous inorganic nanocrystals, because people wondered the instability of perovskite may not be too challenging to solve, because but it seems like it is quite feasible, and I see some excitement over there. So then, do you think that it will be really implemented into the solar cell technology or future display purpose?
I think the easiest application is in display. The easiest application is for sure in display. For solar cells, there are ways that I am proposing to, for example, stabilize cesium lead iodide, just for an example. Either introduce small grains of chalco halides, or even introduce materials that. So, for example, one problem with the perovskite is that they might transform into this 0D phase by reaction with some chemicals. Then one way to revert this reaction is to use chemicals that as a getters that suck this cesium bromide back, cesium halide back from whatever it's formed, like the Prussian blue they have shown. So you can use some MOFs to just make sure that any byproduct that is formed, this is immediately reverted into the original material. So there are some ideas there which people should be testing.
Yeah, that's great. And then, I mean, I know that you are working on the lead-free perovskite, and because people are also, making some negative comments on the potential environmental toxicity of the material with the lead, even though it's quantum milled and there are many good advantages. So can you comment on that? Do you think that you can have a lead-free perovskite?
Not with the same color purity as the lead-based perovskites. So all these alternative to lead, they have emission which is based on a self-trapped excitons, which is broad, because it's in a self-trapped exciton, emission comes from many folds of state, and there is also a strong coupling with phonons. So I would say that if you're looking for bright but broad emission, and maybe also in the near IR, then there are many alternatives to lead. If you're looking into, for example, intense green emission, then you should be looking at alternatives to lead, but maybe you should be doing better indium phosphide nanocrystals.
Okay. Yeah, that's. I mean, new developments and new materials design.
Oh yeah,
that sounds exciting.
The beauty of these metal halides is that they have the ions which are in the lattice have very different ionic radii. So they form structures that are relatively stable. They are difficult to displace, but the richness of this structure is just amazing. There is a richness there in the many type of structures and the features, physical features that you can obtain that cannot be matched, for example, that by the binary or ternary metal chalcogenides. It's just much bigger as a variety. And the fact that people start now to interface them with the chalcogenide or with the chalco halide opens many perspectives. Yeah. We have a few more papers coming out in this direction, in this type of structure.
That sounds exciting, very nice. So if there, there is I think one question. This is to the Raffaella. Do you? Maybe we can stop. I'm just gonna thank the Liberato for your beautiful talk, and maybe we can have a general Q&A session. So maybe Raffaella, you can answer some question on the chat window. Do you see that?
Yeah, no, I did already. So this was.
You did. Oh, okay. So you already
we were
took care of it. All right. Okay.
I had a question for Libero, actually, that I was curious. It's a curiosity. If I may ask.
I will answer
please go ahead.
Any question you do make to me.
Yeah. Right.
I was general question. I was curious about so the polymeric shell, when it's in this globular structure, it prevents the ligand exchange because it's, the anion exchange because it's really dense, or because of electrostatic interactions?
It becomes really dense, and it's also hydrophobic.
Okay.
So it prevents the diffusion of any ionic species, so especially halides.
All right.
And it remains dense when you dry these powders. So for example, this white film that you see, this is the first white emitting film that is entirely made of perovskite. There is nothing else in there. It's only polymers and perovskites.
So, but so it's really dense. So it prevents also oxygen. I mean, it's really
it prevents also oxygen. Yeah. I didn't test, but most likely yes.
Okay.
And this is it's a commercially available block of polymer.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, that's amazing. So any further discussions from the speakers or audience? Yeah, I think we are all done then. Maybe I can just conclude with some remark. I think this has been, one of our trials for special issue, and the journal club sounds very exciting. I think we got to have a wonderful opportunities to learn from the authors. You 4 speakers, you made such a great talks, and then I think we are getting into more in virtual or online meetings because we are all busy or in different locations and so on. Maybe the journal club can continue. This is our second journal club, and from the accounts of chemical researches. So I'd like to thank you all for wonderful, remarkable talks, and I think I'm sure that the audiences enjoyed the talk very much, and then we can keep doing this kind of short or small size of meeting, but very intimate discussions. I think we have done great job, and thank you so much for your participation. And also, I'd like to thank the Marcus and Eric for making this journal club possible from ACS.